You are now listening to the Vegan Stuff podcast with Caavakushi.
Hosting this podcast today are our two AI hosts, Sam and Kim. If you simply can't get enough of us, go to caavakushi.com and sign up for our vegan newsletter and get our free 7-day high-protein vegan meal plan. And we also have some good news. We will be releasing our first ever cookbook pretty soon, so stay tuned. Hey, don't forget to follow us on our socials too.
So picture a high security enclosure. It's dead quiet, heavy, with that really specific kind of tension you only get when something massive is about to break.
Right.
And then a heavy metal gate gets nudged open, but not by a guard and not by a human hand.
Oh, this is the best part.
Yeah, it's opened by a very determined, very wet snout. And one by one, 7 dogs just slip through this narrow gap.
Like incredible.
They don't bark. They don't scramble. They basically execute this coordinated, totally silent dash for freedom into the streets. Welcome to another deep dive on vegan stuff with Caavakushi. I'm your host, Sam.
And I'm your resident expert, Kim.
And today, we are looking at a story where these 7 dogs literally took their fate into their own paws.
Nice one.
I try. But seriously, the video of this escape looks exactly like the climax of like a Prison Break movie.
It really does. It was perfectly orchestrated. But, you know, the truly mind-blowing aspect of this event isn't just the mechanics of how they escaped.
Right, it's the reaction.
Exactly. It's the sheer overwhelming magnitude of what happened the second that security footage hit the internet.
The numbers are honestly hard to wrap your head around. We were looking at the reporting from the South China Morning Post, and this video didn't just go viral in the way your average funny cat video does.
Yeah, it wasn't just a fleeting trend.
No, it became a massive cultural phenomenon. It got a staggering 230 million views. 230 million.
That is just, it's 250 million people.
Yeah. And the comment sections were just flooded. People were cheering them on, analyzing their coordination, and like actively praying they wouldn't get caught.
Which is such a powerful entry point into what we're unpacking today.
Totally. Because for our vegan audience, we're so used to seeing this region portrayed through a very specific singular lens when it comes to animal welfare.
Right. The assumptions are usually pretty monolithic.
But a reaction on that scale, with that much genuine empathy for the freedom of those animals, it forces you to completely rethink those assumptions.
It really reveals this massive undercurrent of domestic support for animal welfare that, honestly, rarely makes international headlines.
And that tension, between the international perception and the really complex reality on the ground, that's what we are fully pulling apart today. Our focus is the Yulin Dog Meat Festival.
It's a heavy topic, for sure.
It is. We are definitely going to look at the grim reality of the event itself. But more importantly, the mission of this deep dive is to examine the massive, highly organized wave of grassroots activism happening right inside China.
We've got a really diverse stack of sources to guide us through this, too.
Yeah, we're pulling from frontline tactical reports from Humane World for Animals, cultural breakdowns from Dialogue Earth and SBS Chinese.
Plus the international angle with reporting from The Guardian and The Independent.
Right. And we'll be critically examining the philosophical arguments presented in advocacy pieces by organizations like PETA, which is obviously super relevant for a vegan perspective.
And we should probably just establish right up front that some of these sources are, fundamentally rooted in strong advocacy.
Oh, absolutely.
They have politically and culturally charged viewpoints, especially when we get into the animal rights philosophy later on. But our goal here is to unpack all of this impartially.
Exactly. We're essentially acting as your guide through the source material, breaking down what these organizations are saying so you, the listener, can see the full picture.
So let's start with the legal framework around this festival. Because the sources present this massive paradox right out of the gate.
Yeah, the government's official stance.
Right. The Chinese government, specifically the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, issued a formal decree. And the exact phrasing they used in this national directive is that dogs are classified as pets, not food.
Which is huge.
The significance really cannot be overstated. From a bureaucratic standpoint, moving an animal from the livestock category to companion animal fundamentally alters its legal standing.
It's a monumental philosophical shift in Beijing.
Exactly. The central authority basically acknowledged that the cultural utility of a dog has shifted.
But, okay, I have to push back on this because this is where the paradox comes in.
Sure.
If the national government, which we know has immense centralized power, makes this sweeping decree that dogs are no longer food, how on earth is this festival still operating?
It's a great question.
I mean, we're talking about an event that draws thousands of people. International media is there. It feels like a rogue municipality just stubbornly clinging to a grim tourist trap, even after national headquarters explicitly changed the company policy.
That's actually a really accurate analogy. You have to look at the mechanics of local versus national governance.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So a national decree is basically a declaration of policy and intent, but the actual enforcement happens at the municipal level. Yulin is a city in the Guangxi region, and it's heavily reliant on its local economy. So local authorities are tasked with balancing those national directives against their local economic drivers. Right. And historically, the dog meat trade, and this festival specifically, has generated significant revenue.
It fills hotels, supports vendors.
Exactly. And when local officials are evaluated primarily on the economic prosperity of their city, there's a really strong bureaucratic incentive to just sort of turn a blind eye
to an industry that brings in cash.
Even if it completely contradicts Beijing's philosophical stance.
There's basically economic preservation disguised as, like, administrative leniency.
Yeah, they create a buffer zone where national policy gets ignored for local commerce.
And the reality inside that buffer zone is exactly what these activists are mobilizing against. Because the reports from Humane World for animals are, well, they're clinical, but they are absolutely devastating.
They really are. They document thousands of animals crammed so tightly into these stacked wire cages.
And during transport across massive distances with no food, no water, and the slaughter methods, I mean, as vegans, this is always hard to talk about, but it's important to acknowledge the reality. The sources explicitly note pups being boiled alive.
It's horrific.
And legs being blowtorched to prepare specific snacks for the crowds.
Because the methods are designed entirely for volume and spectacle, not welfare.
And the implications go way beyond just the immediate cruelty. One of our sources actually explicitly mentions that Yulin presents an alarming risk to the UK.
Yeah, I saw that.
At first I was like, what is the connection there? It seemed completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
But when you look at the conditions, cramming undocumented, highly stressed, sick animals together, it's not just an animal rights issue.
No, it's a massive epidemiological one.
Right. This is exactly how zoonotic diseases jump borders.
Precisely. The mechanics of a zoonotic spillover require exactly this kind of environment. You've got animals sourced from completely unregulated channels.
Stray dogs, stolen pets.
With zero known health history. The stress of capture and transport completely tanks their immune systems. Then they're thrown into an environment where bodily fluids are just freely mixing.
It's a pressure cooker for pathogens.
If a novel virus, or even just rabies, enters that population, it acts as a massive incubator. So the risk to the UK, or any country, isn't that a dog from Yulin ends up in London?
Right.
The risk is that a mutated pathogen jumps from an animal to a handler in this unregulated market, boards an international flight, and enters the global supply chain.
Wow. So the local economic benefit is actively gambling with global public health.
Essentially, yes.
And the local defenders of the festival, they try to shield this whole operation by claiming it's this ancient, untouchable cultural heritage.
Right, the tradition argument.
But the source material from Dialogue Earth just completely dismantles that. They have this analysis titled Dog Meat Festival. Is it all about tourists?
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. They look at the actual timeline.
Yeah.
And they point out that, yeah, eating dog meat does have historical roots in some rural areas, mostly as a desperate survival mechanism during severe famines.
Right. Historically.
But the Yulin Dog Meat Festival itself, it is not some ancient tradition passed down for centuries.
Not at all. The timeline is the most revealing piece of data here. The festival, as a branded, structured event, was inaugurated in 2009.
2009, that is incredibly recent. I mean, the iPhone had already been out for 2 years.
Exactly. It's a textbook example of manufactured tradition.
Wow.
The Dialogue Earth piece suggests the event was engineered by local dog meat traders specifically to stimulate a flagging industry. By the late 2000s, consumption was actually dropping.
Because demographics were changing, people were getting pets.
Yes. So the traders needed a mechanism to boost sales and drive tourism. By packaging this slaughter as a traditional festival, they achieved two things.
What were they?
First, they created a spectacle to draw crowds. And second, and this is the insidious part, they wrapped a commercial enterprise in the protective cloak of cultural heritage.
That is a brilliant, albeit totally cynical marketing strategy.
Yeah, it really is.
Because if you attack a local business, you're just critiquing a product. But the second they rebrand it as a custom, suddenly any criticism is framed as an attack on their culture.
They weaponize tradition to protect a profit margin.
Unbelievable. We're talking about how this festival is largely a manufactured tradition.
Right.
And understanding that is crucial to understanding the resistance against it. Because for years, the international media coverage heavily relied on this trope of the Western savior.
Oh, absolutely. The narrative that enlightenment regarding animal welfare only comes from Western NGOs swooping in to intervene.
But our sources paint a completely different picture. The most effective, high-risk activism isn't coming from outside the country at all.
No, the frontline resistance is overwhelmingly led by Chinese citizens. Domestic NGOs, young activists, operating entirely within their own borders.
It is a totally homegrown movement, which brings us right back to those 230 million views on the Escape video.
Right. You do not generate 250 million views celebrating the freedom of dogs in a society that universally views them as livestock.
It's just statistical proof of a massive cultural shift. And the SBS Chinese source really digs into this. They ask this core question. Is it a custom to eat dog meat?
And their demographic breakdown is so telling, it reveals a massive generational divide.
Yeah, driven by economic history.
Exactly. Older generations, especially in rural areas, they lived through periods of profound scarcity and famine. Their relationship with animals was defined by strict utility, survival.
Which is understandable in that context?
Completely. But the younger generations, the expanding urban middle class, they've grown up in a completely different economic reality.
They are part of this booming pet economy.
Spending billions on veterinary care, specialized food, grooming. Their psychological categorization of a dog is identical to a pet owner in London or New York.
The animal is a family member.
Yes.
So when these younger generations see the footage coming out of Yulin, they aren't seeing the preservation of a custom.
No, they're seeing the mass slaughter of family members.
And that visceral reaction is driving this highly organized tactical resistance. Like the reports from Humane World for Animals detailing the highway interceptors, it reads like a masterclass in bureaucratic disruption.
It's incredible. These aren't just people holding signs. These are highly coordinated logistical operations to physically stop the transport trucks before they ever reach the city.
Which blew my mind. I kept thinking of it like an underground railroad for animals, or like a high-stakes heist movie, but the precious cargo is living, breathing dogs.
The logistics are staggering. They rely on networks of spotters, tracking specific vehicle routes, and coordinating safe interceptions on provincial highways.
But the craziest part to me was the tactics. Because initially I was like, how are everyday citizens forcing commercial trucks to pull over? It's not a physical hijacking.
Right, they aren't running them off the road.
It's an administrative takedown. It's literally like getting Al Capone on tax evasion. They know they can't arrest the drivers for animal cruelty because local enforcement won't back them up.
So they get them on the paperwork.
Yes, they use the transport laws. Because China actually has really strict regulations about moving live animals across provincial borders, right?
Right, exactly, to prevent disease spread.
Yeah.
So the drivers are required by national law to have individual health certificates.
For every single dog.
For every single animal on that truck. And proof of origin. So activists have identified the structural weakness of the trade. It relies almost entirely on illegal smuggling.
Because these dogs aren't coming from regulated farms.
No, they are overwhelmingly stolen pets or street dogs snatched from neighborhoods. So the drivers obviously cannot produce the legal documentation.
So when activists pull them over, they just call the local police and demand a paperwork inspection.
It is brilliant. They leverage the national health and transport codes against the local smugglers. The police are forced to intervene, not necessarily for animal welfare, but because a major quarantine violation is happening right there on the highway.
They are literally weaponizing the bureaucracy to save lives. And the scale of these operations and the sources is just wild. On the eve of the festival, there was a coordinated effort where they stopped a truck carrying 386 dogs.
Just visualize that. A heavy transport truck packed with nearly 400 terrified animals.
And stopping the truck is only the first phase.
Oh, yeah. The aftermath is a massive undertaking.
Because once the police confiscate the animals, you suddenly have 386 severely traumatized, dehydrated, injured dogs sitting on the side of a highway.
The activists have to instantly coordinate rapid veterinary triage, secure transport to safe facilities, provide emergency medical care.
Quarantine the sick ones.
Exactly, to prevent distemper or parvovirus outbreaks within the rescued group, and then eventually find long-term sheltering or adoption. The financial and emotional toll on these domestic networks is immense.
And it's not an isolated incident at all. The sources highlight multiple operations. Another truck packed with 68 dogs was stopped, and every single one was saved.
There was also that rescue of 10 vulnerable puppies right as the festival was starting.
The sheer persistence is incredible. But, while the physical front line is managed domestically, the international pressure definitely plays a vital supporting role.
Oh, definitely. The global spotlight makes it incredibly difficult for the local authorities to just operate quietly in the shadows.
Right. And the sources point to a petition by the Eurogroup for animals that got 1.5 million signatures.
1.5 million people mobilizing around a single municipal event.
And alongside that, you have this highly visible celebrity advocacy, like comedian Ricky Gervais.
He's been a very prominent vocal critic of the festival.
Yeah. And what's truly interesting is how advocacy groups leverage that celebrity attention. Humane Society International actually rescued a specific dog from the meat trade and named him Little Ricky in his honor.
Which is a very calculated, highly effective psychological strategy.
Let's break that down because I find this fascinating.
It taps into a well-documented cognitive bias called the identifiable victim effect.
How does that work in this context?
So the human brain isn't really wired to process mass suffering. When you hear a statistic like 386 dogs packed in a truck or thousands slaughtered, the scale is just too massive to comprehend emotionally.
Right, it becomes abstract, just a data point.
Exactly. But the moment you extract one single dog from that mass, and you give him a name like Little Ricky or another dog mentioned in the sources named Lucky, you completely change the cognitive processing.
You take the abstract and make it concrete.
Yes. You're no longer asking the public to care about a blurry concept of thousands. You're asking them to look at a specific face, an individual personality, a personal survival story.
People form a parasocial bond with that one animal.
They want to know if he's eating, if his injuries are healing, if he got adopted. By focusing on the individual, organizations bypass the paralyzing effect of mass statistics,
which triggers a direct, empathetic response.
And that's crucial for sustaining engagement and driving donations.
It gives people a tangible narrative of hope inside a massive crisis.
It really does.
So, Kim, right before the break, we were talking about this sustained siege on the festival, the domestic interceptions, the international pressure.
Right.
But then, as the sources highlight, an entirely unforeseen variable entered the chat.
The pandemic.
Yes. And the timeline here is wild. I was looking at this headline from the source LifeGate, and it says, "Not even coronavirus has stopped the Yulin dog meat festival."
It seems totally contradictory on the surface.
Right. We're talking about a virus that paralyzed international travel, crashed markets, forced billions into lockdown, and yet this local event in Guangxi just proceeded. It's like an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object.
It is mind-boggling. But that headline really only tells part of the story. If you look at the underlying mechanics during those pandemic years, the virus didn't just leave the festival untouched.
It actually gave activists leverage.
The most potent leverage they had ever possessed. They executed this brilliant strategic pivot.
Because the entire nature of the global conversation completely shifted overnight.
Exactly. Think about it. Prior to the pandemic, the primary argument activists used was ethical. They argued against the cruelty.
Which is valid, but
it can be easily dismissed by local officials who just say, well, we don't share those ethical priorities, or they hide behind the cultural tradition shield.
Right.
But when COVID-19 hit, it dominated every aspect of global and domestic consciousness. The activists realized the ethical argument was no longer their sharpest tool.
So they pivoted to public health.
They weaponized the health crisis. They started aggressively highlighting the unregulated wet markets, the lack of quarantine, the high-stress crowding of sick animals.
They weren't just saying it's cruel anymore.
No, they were saying, this is a ticking time bomb for the next pandemic. They framed it as an acute, existential threat to national public health.
Which is a masterstroke in advocacy.
True.
Because a local official might ignore 1 million signatures from Europe complaining about cruelty. But they cannot ignore an argument claiming their city is incubating a virus.
Especially when the central government in Beijing is aggressively cracking down on wildlife markets to prevent another outbreak.
They basically forced the local government into a corner using Beijing's own health mandates.
And the combined weight of all that, the interceptions, the PR nightmare, the undeniable pandemic risks, It caused a tangible structural shift.
The new look Yulin.
Yes. The sources include a media release from the Global Anti-Dog Meat Coalition talking about this new look Yulin festival.
Which sounds so weird, like a corporate rebranding of something horrific. What does that actually mean?
It's basically an acknowledgement that the event was forced to fundamentally alter its visibility. A new look festival is essentially one that has been driven underground.
Ah, okay.
Historically, it was defined by massive public spectacle, open-air slaughters, large displays of carcasses, aggressive tourism marketing. But buckling under pressure, the local government had to curtail all that.
So the public slaughters were banned or hidden.
The scale was dramatically reduced, and the marketing was silenced.
So it's a victory, but a really complex one. The spectacle is gone, but the underlying trade hasn't been eradicated yet.
Right, it's a gradual dismantling. But analyzing this specific festival inevitably acts as a catalyst for a much broader and, frankly, much more uncomfortable philosophical examination.
Which brings us to the most provocative piece of source material in our stack today, especially for our vegan listeners.
The PETA article.
Yes. We're transitioning into the deep philosophical stuff here. The PETA article is titled, "Do These Photos from the Yulin Dog Meat Festival Remind You of Anything?"
And keeping our mission in mind, we're unpacking the mechanics of their argument here to understand the broader global conversation.
Right. And the entire premise of PETA's argument relies on forcing the audience to confront cognitive dissonance.
Which is a fascinating psychological state.
Let's break down how cognitive dissonance functions in this specific context.
So cognitive dissonance is the severe mental friction you experience when you try to hold two contradictory beliefs or values at the same time. The brain naturally seeks consistency.
Right, and when actions conflict with beliefs, it creates stress.
Exactly, and PETA's visual campaign is designed to directly trigger that stress.
They do it by holding up a comparative mirror to a Western audience. They basically say, look at these photos from Yulin. Like the transport truck with 386 dogs.
And they ask the viewer to acknowledge the intense, visceral outrage that image provokes. The petitions, the donations, the deep empathy.
And then, side by side, they present an image of a transport truck on a highway in the US or the UK, packed with 386 pigs headed for a commercial slaughterhouse.
And PETA demands that the viewer reconcile their reaction to those two images. They point out a glaring contradiction.
Which, as vegans, we know all too well.
Right. Pigs are highly sentient, deeply social animals. By numerous cognitive metrics, a pig demonstrates problem-solving capabilities, spatial memory, and social complexities that rival or even exceed an average dog.
Yet the industrialized slaughter of millions of pigs happens every single day, completely unquestioned and normalized by the general public.
While the slaughter of dogs at Yulin sparks international fury.
PETA is essentially challenging the listener directly. Why does boiling a puppy horrify us to our core, but the systematic slaughter of highly intelligent pigs is just accepted as normal background noise?
It is a direct, aggressive challenge to our cultural defaults.
And within animal rights philosophy, the mechanism driving those defaults has a specific name.
Speciesism.
Let's define speciesism clearly, because it is the absolute linchpin of this entire argument.
In ethical philosophy, speciesism is the assumption of human superiority that leads to the exploitation of non-human animals. But, as it applies here, it refers to the deeply ingrained, entirely arbitrary ways we categorize different species.
The boxes we put them in.
Exactly. From the moment we're born, we're culturally conditioned to place animals into distinct functional boxes. We take dogs, cats, horses, and put them in the companion or family box.
We give them names, we buy them expensive food, we advocate for their legal protection, we grieve when they die.
And simultaneously, we are conditioned to take other animals, pigs, cows, chickens, and place them firmly in the resource or livestock box.
But the critical point PETA makes is that there is absolutely no underlying biological imperative that says a dog is a friend and a pig is food.
None. A pig feels pain, experiences fear, and seeks social bonding just like a dog does. The line dividing the two is not biological, it's entirely cultural, economic, and societal conditioning.
So what the Yulin Festival does, and why it generates such an explosive reaction in the West, is that it completely shatters that cultural categorization.
Yes. It takes an animal that the West has firmly placed in the family box and treats it as a resource.
The dissonance isn't just about the cruelty itself. It's about a fundamental violation of the categories we use to organize our empathy.
It forces people to realize their categories are arbitrary.
Which is the core of the vegan perspective on Yulin. They aren't saying the outrage over the dog meat festival is wrong.
No, not at all. They argue that it's just incomplete.
Right. The empathy you feel for little Ricky, or the massive relief you feel watching those 7 dogs escape, that is entirely valid.
But logic and ethical consistency demand that this exact same empathy be extended to all sentient beings suffering in agricultural systems worldwide.
Regardless of what cultural box they've been placed in.
It is a powerful, deeply uncomfortable philosophical mirror.
It really is.
Yeah.
And engaging with the mechanics of this argument forces you to critically evaluate the architecture of your own empathy. It connects Yulin directly to the daily, global relationship between humans and animals.
It expands the context immensely. The intersection of manufactured tradition, municipal economics, grassroots resistance, and global ethics makes this one of the most complex issues in modern animal welfare.
Okay, so synthesizing everything we've unpacked today, what are the primary takeaways? We've covered a huge amount of logistical and philosophical ground.
We really have.
The Yulin Dog Meat Festival obviously remains a focal point of severe cruelty. The reports are documented realities. But the narrative that this represents a monolithic culture universally embracing the trade.
Demonstrably false.
Right.
The most vital realization is the scale and sophistication of the domestic resistance. Chinese citizens, driven by deep empathy, are taking immense personal risks.
They're navigating complex legal frameworks, auditing transport trucks, coordinating massive logistical rescues.
They are dismantling this industry from the inside out. They aren't waiting for outside intervention. They are leading the charge to shift their own cultural landscape.
And the sources are really clear that if you are moved by this reality, there are actionable steps you can take. You can actively amplify the voices and documentation provided by these Chinese activists.
Ensure their work is seen globally.
Yes, you can sign international petitions because, as we discussed, geopolitical pressure forces local governments to restrict the trade.
And most importantly, you can financially support the organizations executing these high-stakes interceptions on the ground.
They need those resources for veterinary triage and long-term sheltering.
Because dismantling an entrenched industry is a gradual process of attrition. Every single intervention shifts the balance of power.
We opened today's deep dive with a really cinematic image. 7 dogs who saw a narrow gap in a metal fence, recognized an opportunity, and made a silent dash for freedom.
They fought for their own autonomy.
And in doing so, they forced 250 million people to watch and reflect on the value of their lives. So, as we wrap up our analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Something that synthesizes the local activism with the broader global philosophy.
Exactly. The next time you sit down to a meal, or the next time you're driving down the highway and you pass a massive metal transport truck packed with livestock headed for a commercial facility, ask yourself, who originally drew the invisible line between the animals we fight to save and the animals we systematize to serve?
That's the real question.
And more importantly, having looked at how arbitrary that line truly is it time for you to redraw it for yourself? Thank you for listening to this Vegan Stuff with Caavakushi Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. We hope you liked this episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. Also, we would be so appreciative if you could just share this episode or this podcast with all your friends and family who are vegans or vegan friendly. We're also really excited because we are going to be launching something really cool pretty soon on the site, so keep an eye out for that. And we will see you really soon with a new episode.